The governor's special election is coming up on November 8th. What does it mean for education? Stay with us for analysis by Assemblyman Gene Mullen when we come back.
In January, it's so nice, while swimming on sliding ice. To sip hot chicken soup with rice, sipping once, sipping twice, sipping chicken soup with rice. Get it right, go away, so far stay home all day, and dream about my soup all day. Home right once, home right twice, eating chicken soup with rice, chicken soup with rice.
Hi, I'm Bruce Grantham, and welcome to Our Children, Our Future, a program about education in the South San Francisco Unified School District. On the November 8th special election, there are 8 propositions that are going to be put to the voters. At least 3 of them directly affect education. With me tonight to discuss the impact of these propositions is Gene Mullen, Assemblyman from the 19th District. Gene, welcome and thank you for coming on this evening.
My pleasure, Bruce. Nice to see you.
Busy time of the year for you back in the district.
Well, we're out of session, legislative session, so I'm spending most of my time in the district, and they've got me hopping around from place to place.
That's good. It's good for you. Let's take a look at Propositions 74, 75, and 76, one by one. And if you can kind of synthesize for us what a yes vote means on each of these propositions, what a no vote means, and what the impact and implications are for education, for public education. Let's start with 74, which is commonly called the Public School Teacher Tenure and Dismissal Process proposition.
Well, to begin with, anybody in California with $2 million can get something on the ballot before an electorate from 36 million people. So I'm not sure I'm an expert on all of the measures that are on the ballot because most of them are initiatives. However, I do sit on Education Committee, and we have looked at all of these, and one at least to some degree. 74 deals with lengthening the time that teachers are required before they're given permanent status, commonly called tenure. When you and I started teaching, it was typically 3 years, and then when you signed a contract for your 4th year, you're given permanent status. Over the years, that's been reduced to 2 years. This particular measure would lengthen it to 5 years, so you would have to serve 5 full years of probation, during which period you could be fired at any time for no reason at all, simply be told that you're not going to be retained the following year. That's one part of it. We tried to work with the governor to moderate that, to say we'd be willing to go back to 3 years, but the measure was kind of had its own momentum behind it, so it went onto the ballot.
If I can interrupt a second, I think, wasn't it 1991 that we went from 3 years to 2 years? And there really wasn't any real good reason for it, other than it was some kind of deal that was being made with the governor at that time or the legislature at that time in CTA?
Right. I think you and I probably both know, being longtime veterans in the education business, that in my case I've had more than 30 student teachers as a master teacher over the 30 years I taught. And you know, pretty much by the end of the student teaching period, certainly you have a very strong idea after 1 year, and after 2 full years in a classroom with making sure that there's adequate supervision, you have a pretty good handle on which people are going to make it as teachers, will be solid teachers. You know who the stars are going to be, and you also know those who should perhaps choose a different field. So I'm not sure that this 5 years has any realistic chance of making those who enter the profession any better. In fact, the reality is that when people look at other career choices, they say, gee, probation of 5 years.
5 years, a long time to wait, huh?
But, you know, that certainly dominates the thought process when you don't have anywhere near that length of time in any other profession. The second part, and perhaps somewhat more troubling, is that a longtime teacher who has, for whatever reason, 2 consecutive unsatisfactory evaluations can, at the end of that second year unsatisfactory evaluation, be dismissed. Now, there are some processes that go along, but this, if you will, short circuits what I would consider a due process by being able to get rid of someone who may have had all sorts of legitimate reasons, or there could have been personality conflicts with whoever the administrator was that was doing the evaluation. So it puts I think almost a cloud over the whole idea of having some permanency in your job and some freedom in your job to do your job the way you see being.
And as I understand it, the way the initiative is written, that 2 consecutive unsatisfactory evaluations by the supervisor would be grounds for dismissal.
Correct.
At any time.
Correct.
And how do you define unsatisfactory is going to be the big issue.
Eye of the beholder in many ways. There are some provisions that there can be a court adjudication if there's going to be concern about the way that unfolds, but by and large, it just seems to put a damper on the academic freedom, which is, I think, certainly a major issue in having tenure. I mean, that's the whole reason for tenure, is you get some freedom from outside pressures, and I think the rationale that's provided is it's so difficult to fire teachers that this
once they have tenure
makes it a much more efficient process. In reality, when you have teachers who are not performing, they know they're not performing, and a lot of them will leave the profession. You know, about half the teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years anyway. I would say that many of those understand that this is just not the job for them, and so to take away the rights of a large group of people in order to maybe make it easier to fire the occasional dud, when in reality most of those people leave the profession anyway. So,
and there's already a process in place to do that anyway. Let's move on. Let's move on to Prop 75, sure. And this is the use of public employee union dues for political contributions and making it a sign-off where you've got to sign yes as opposed to the way it is now.
Right. Yeah. Opt-in as opposed to opt-out. Right. This is sort of a retake on a prior measure that wanted to require a union dues checkoff for all unions, not just public employees. This is a sort of a second bite of that apple. I think, in my view, this is really an equity issue. What it does is it places the onus on unions, which typically support Democratic candidates, yet there's no comparable requirement that's placed on the business community, which, again, with their exceptions, typically tend to support Republican candidates. And so you have one group that already has a provision to allow opting out from your union dues being used for political reasons, and to change the dynamics to make it very difficult for union voices to continue to be heard. So I think of all of the issues, and there are a number on this particular special election ballot, this one I think is pretty much geared for a political end, and that is to dampen down the resources of those who tend to support the party that opposes some of what the governor does. So
Proposition 76, which is probably the one that has the biggest long-range impact for education because it has to do with funding. That's the proposition that limits state spending in school and puts funding limits on school funding specifically. What about that one?
Tricky issue. We've gotten a lot of information on both sides of this. It purports to, and it's really sounding quite negative. I'm not negative on everything the governor does. We tend to work with him as well as we can in many areas. This has some really hidden problems in it with respect to giving the governor unilateral authority to do budget cutting in all the programs that can be cut, including schools, which makes budgeting for schools, given the uncertainty of that budgeting continuing throughout the year, a real nightmare. It's got some triggers in it. It says when the director of the Department of Finance on a quarterly basis determines that the revenues coming into the state fall 1.5% below the expectations, then that gives the legislature 45 days to enact a series of cuts to bring that back in balance. Well, California's got a budget, all funds can combine, that runs in the $112 billion per year, and somebody in Santa Ana sneezes and the budget changes a little bit. It's a huge operation, and so 1.5% is not really too far off. That can change up or down. In fact, 1.5% is almost budget dust, as a phrase that people use in this. I guess I use it too. Come to think of it,
Just
in
did.
the Capitol. So it's a trigger that is it's a hair trigger that really is, I think, provides the governor with too much opportunity, because if we can't come up with a series of cuts within 45 days, then the governor makes his own cuts in the following 10 days. That's part of it, and that's, I think, a real problem. We can then take the governors. It gets a little convoluted, and that's what happens with initiatives. There are all sorts of mazes that you have to follow in order to get actually where it's
Gene,
going.
let's take a break, and then we'll re-enter that maze when we come back.
Okay, sounds good.
So we'll continue our conversation with Gene Mullen when we come back, specifically on Proposition 76. Stay with us.
It's so nice. Walk women on sliding ice.
Prudential California Realty is pleased to support the South San Francisco Unified School District. With several offices located throughout the South Bay, we help home buyers realize their dreams of ownership and sellers maximize their home investment. Prudential California Realty is a longtime partner with education, having created the Education Foundation in 1992, which provides grants to teachers throughout Northern California. Prudential California Realty, your partner in real estate.
You've always been like a son to me, Mikey. And that's why I find it unfortunate that we're in this little situation here. No, don't do it. Don't do it. You're gonna pay for this. Peninsula TV. How will it affect you?
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Assemblyman Gene Mullen on the propositions, and when we ended, Gene, we were getting to what Prop 76 does for the guarantees in Prop 98 public school funding.
Yeah. I'm sorry I'm being a little convoluted about this, but it is
It's a
complicated initiative,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons that that legislation by initiative is probably at best a pretty iffy and chancy operation. This proposition on the ballot would, in essence, negate Prop 98 and would give the governor unilateral authority to cut the funding guarantees. And don't think that that's not part of it. In addition to that, at the end of the budget cycle, and remember, keeping in mind we need 2/3 vote to get a budget in place. If we don't have a budget within a specified period at the end of the budget year, then automatically the previous year's budget goes into effect. And for those that want to reduce spending, starve the beast of government, so to speak, then there's absolutely no incentive to come to any agreement on a new budget, because what will happen is you simply will operate on the previous year's revenues.
You just roll it over.
So it's got, I think, some real major difficulties with it, but it negates the checks and balances and the separation of powers that you see that I, as a government teacher, taught for all those years. This puts too much power in the hands of one individual. I wouldn't want the legislature to have that power. I don't want the governor to have that power.
So it becomes more of a case of checks and balances in Sacramento when you really come down to it.
Well, those checks and balances are out the window. If you have if the governor has the unilateral power to cut the budget under very iffy circumstances, and our ability to stop that is literally controlled by the other political party, then you are substituting a solo instead of a chorus, and it should be a chorus under checks and balances.
One of the things when the public goes to the polls is, what kind of information that they have and what kind of ideas and preconceptions that they take with them when they go to the polls to vote on some of these things that impact not only their lives in many other areas, but in education.
Sure.
And one of the things that I wanted to do with you was to explore some of the myths and realities that and misperceptions maybe that people have about education, public education, and school funding. And I want to take some questions from a document that was prepared by two advocates, public school advocates that work in Sacramento.
Okay.
Stephen Rose and Brent McFadden. I want to make sure that I give them credit for this because I'm going to be taking some of their material. But they put it in terms of myths, and they cite a quote from T.S. Eliot that says, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. And oftentimes in the shadow are these myths and misconceptions about what's actually going on. And one of the myths that's floating around with the public, and maybe somewhat in Sacramento, is that schools are getting almost 7% fund boost in 2005. Whereas a legislative analyst says when you start, take the smoke and mirrors away and so forth, we're talking really about 1.25%.
Which is falling below the inflation rate. So, in essence, you could say that schools will be operating under this year's funding at a level that was less than last year's. There are growths in revenues that go to education, but the majority of those growths are based on new student enrollment. So you may get a little more money, but you get kids that go along with that.
And the expenses that go with more kids.
Absolutely. And that, by the way, is very unevenly divided. You have high growth areas, and then you have, particularly in our area, South San Francisco, and many of the schools on the peninsula have declining enrollment, which means that their funding is being decreased because the number of students they serve is decreased. But when you take a look at the raw figures that has been provided, the 7.1% increase, that discounts the fact that under the governor's plan, there's going to be the obligation of the school district to pick up the state's general fund share into the state teachers' retirement system. That's about $500 million. I'm pretty familiar with that. We've had some legislation about that. And then the vehicle license fee, the so-called car tax, has fallen short of the projections, and so there's another almost $500 million that is going from education to local government to backfill that requirement. And we could spend many programs talking about the vehicle license fee and the impact it's had on legislators trying to balance the budget in Sacramento. And so then you take those two elements, you subtract those from the total amount, you add to that the growth in enrollment in certain areas. When you take those out of that 7%, you're left with, as you indicated, something in the low 1 point something percent, which is below the rate of inflation. And so in essence, not smoke and mirrors, there's no 7%. There is less money available per capita than there was in the previous year.
To even handle inflation. The second myth is that education funding is the problem behind the financial crisis, that the Prop 98 guarantees are responsible for the budget mess that we're in.
Well, I sit on Education Committee, and we deal with a lot of these issues. I don't sit on the finance end, but we do sit on the policy end. One of the things that people tend to overlook is the fact that there's been a huge run-up in property values. And of the 1,000 school districts, plus 1,015 in California, all but fewer than 100 are base revenue limit districts. And as a result of that, their funding the state makes up the difference between what property taxes fund and the revenue limit. And as property taxes go up, more of the funding for education comes from the local communities and less comes from the state. So in essence, you can say that education is costing the state government less and the local people, local taxpayers more. So it's
and in fact it has. It's less of a drain on the general fund than it's ever been because property taxes are going up.
That's right.
So high.
Right. It's interesting how you can truncate what was a long explanation.
And education has a spending problem. There's that perception out there. Just let me interject something there. The most recent data indicates that California spends over $1,000 less per student than the national average, and that we are like 43rd out of 50 states in what we spend for public education. Yet there is the myth that education has a spending problem.
you can take data from a variety of different sources. Even those that are highly supportive of the governor's programs will concede that we fall short of the median. They would say we're somewhere between 25 and 28 or 29 on the national average. You can manipulate those figures any way you want, and you can show that we're in the 40s. But I think the salient point is we're below nobody disputes the fact we're below the national average by well over $1,000 a student, and we're doing that in a very high income state compared to many of the other ones. And so
per capita, exactly.
Absolutely. So there is substantially less funding going forward to education than you find nationally on average.
We tend to put our money in prisons, police, fire, health, and transportation.
All of which have a constituency, all of which are important services, but instead of us building fences at the top of the cliff, we're running ambulances at the bottom. So we're putting lots of money in prisons, where that money spent in schools would probably be able to reduce the rate of people going into incarceration. So we've got a little bit screwed up. And California's a wealthy state. Make no mistake about it that there is a lot of money generated. There's a lot of money spent. But when we take a look at our priorities, I think when you compare prisons and schools, we're a little bit screwed up in which we fund at the highest levels.
So we've been a little bit negative in the first couple of segments, but we're going to wrap.
We've been totally negative.
We're going to wrap this up in the next segment and talk a little bit about some ideas maybe that
Sure.
your office is coming up with that
Sure.
might be able to generate some more revenues for schools and help out the public school system a little bit. So when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Assemblyman Mullen. So don't go away.
It's so nice. Walk swimming on sliding ice.
If every single person voted, then it could change the whole world.
If you vote, then your voice is heard.
Even if you don't have an opinion on other stuff, you want to vote for stuff with your community.
One vote can change anything.
Register and vote.
You are a role model for people that are in a couple of years going to vote. And if you don't vote, then they probably won't vote, and then pretty soon we're only going to have like 5 or 6 people in the whole USA voting.
If everyone had the same opinions in the world, it would be boring.
You should vote.
I'd vote if I could.
Well, just go ahead and vote. I mean, you have the whole day. You have 13 hours to vote. Why not just go and vote?
We're counting on you.
Vote!
Join the game's Mark Simon and Bob Marks for live election night coverage. Live election night coverage on Peninsula TV, Channel 26. Get the latest results. Plus analysis about the state and local races. And hear from personalities from throughout the area. Peninsula TV. The only place to be on election night. Live November 8th at 8 p.m. For more details, go to PenTV.tv.
Welcome back. Continuing our conversation with Assemblyman Gene Mullen. Gene, what's out there new on the horizon that'll lend a hand to public education funding?
Well, there's it's usually a zero-sum game. You take money from one program to fund another program. But we have, I think, this year an opportunity, particularly in the lottery. A step back, most people think, gee, we brought the lottery into California. That should fund education.
And initially, that was supposed to be extra money.
That was
for instructional supplies, equipment. It was going to be all of the nice things that schools couldn't afford from general fund and property taxes.
Correct.
And it was going to make everything beautiful and wonderful. And everybody says, geez, where's all that lottery money going?
Right. Well, it of course got merged right into the general fund of most school districts by necessity. It accounts for about 2% of educational funding throughout the state. So while it's a significant amount, it's still minuscule by comparison to the rest of the funding. But we do have an opportunity this year with California joining the Mega Millions lottery, which we believe is going to generate something in the neighborhood of about $500 million more than the lottery has been generating in years past. It's actually the projections suggest maybe $700 million, but there'll be a $200 million loss in the other segments of the lottery. I'm not really conversant with the lottery other than we see it as potentially a source of new revenues that can be directed to the schools. And I have language currently with the Legislative Council that does the lawyers at the state that actually write constitutional amendments that will address how to take those monies and direct them toward the lower wealth school districts in the state. There are some formulas that we're working on that are based on what is taking place in other states. So we're hopeful to have that ready for introduction in some form in January. We have been talking to all sides, including the governor's office, about it, as well as the legislative analyst's office. And so we're pretty excited. We think we may be able to do something in that area. In addition to that, I have legislation that's a 2-year bill that will phase in budget reductions for declining enrollment districts. Of the 1,000 school districts, about 500 are growing and 500 are declining. And when you decline, the amount of money you receive is reduced because the number of
Sure.
pupils you service is reduced. But the programs take a while to sort of adjust to the fact that you have less money coming in because there's fewer students. And so currently you can take the student count for either the current year or 1 year previous. I have legislation that will phase that in over a 3-year period to lessen the immediate impact on declining enrollment districts, which hurt urban districts and suburban districts, but they're devastating to rural districts. And as a result of that, we have a number of Republican legislators who represent rural areas in California that are very interested in supporting the bill that will lessen the pain, as it were, for those that have declining enrollment. I have an opportunity to introduce 40 bills every 2 years. I've got about 20 slots still available. We are currently going through what we call pitch sessions. We have other kind of sessions that are
start with a different letter.
That. Yeah. And we're looking at legislation. About half the bills will deal with housing, and then the other half the bulk of those will be education bills, and we'll deal with education funding. So we're working hard to see if we can come up with not only bills that make sense, but bills that make sense that have a chance to actually get through the process to the governor's desk and be signed, which of course is the ultimate goal of all legislation.
And I guess kind of to wrap all this up, I think one of the things that's disturbing is that the rhetoric coming out of Sacramento is constantly pro-education, pro-education. It's number one on everybody's list. Yet somehow when the funding comes down the pipeline, it just doesn't seem to reach the top the way everybody's saying that it should. So hopefully there's some help down the road with the mega lottery. And Gene, thank you very much for coming on and taking time out of your schedule.
Always my pleasure, Bruce. Look forward to seeing you again.
You've been watching Our Children, Our Future. Bruce Grantham. See you next time.
This is Peninsula TV, your community channel.